Hello and welcome to the first of two lessons in which we're going to be covering the Sage CRM web services. Specifically in this lesson we're going to be really thinking about what are called the SOAP-based web services. SOAP standing for, well, it doesn't really stand for anything now, but it used to stand for Simple Object Access Protocol, but the standard now just refers to it as a particular type of web service offering remote access and remote procedure calling. So we're going to look at that idea of what this type of API represents, the Web Services API. We'll look at the configuration of it. We'll understand the way in which sessions are created and maintained. And we'll also have a think about the objects and functions and where you can learn more about those. So we'll be making extensive reference to the online help and to the example documentation and articles which talk more about the usage. But I'm very much aware that some people may not have a background in creating web service applications. So we're going to start simply and so understand about this. Now, in order to get going, we need obviously Sage CRM. So if I switch over and log on, there's something to point out about the nature of the software that we're using. And so while that's starting up, I'll also start up and go into the cloud as well. So I'll log on to two separate systems, because when we're dealing with Sage CRM, we have the choice really of the environments as whether we're dealing with the on-premise or the cloud edition. Well, back and while I've let my cloud install, you can see I've switched back and I'm now looking at here the dashboard of my instance. I'm on a slightly different network than before, so you can see that I'm getting an error message indicating that I'm using an unregistered version of Sage CRM. That itself is, as I said, just because I'm on an unusual network segment as I'm carrying out this task. What I want to do here is to go into the administration screens and come along into where we've got details of the license key. Now I've come here because I want to point out that we've got the enterprise integration server and developer license in this install, and you would naturally expect I should be able to use just about any API that I want to use. But in fact, it doesn't matter within the on-premise environment whether you have these or not. Every instance of Sage CRM within the on-premise environment can make use of the Web Services API. It's a fundamental method in order to be able to have a remote system being able to interact with Sage CRM on the basis of create, read, update, and delete of data. That's not quite the same for the cloud instance, and here you can see I switched over into the cloud instance of Sage CRM, and if I switch over into the administration area and then have a look at where we are managing the account and that we can see that we've got the details here for the web services and the different types of web services. Now, we'll be exploring the idea of the RESTful API in the course of the second lesson on web services. So here we're just thinking about SOAP. And SOAP, though, as one mechanism, this is the web services and the connection string here, is only available if you are using the professional version of the cloud edition. So it is all to do with the professional level of the subscription. You can see that I'm working with a free trial, and free trial are always there. It's always dealing with then the professional edition when it's a free trial within the cloud. Back we come though into Sage CRM, and in a moment we're going to be looking within the system area at the setup and configuration of web services. But before I really get going with that, I should start thinking about what we're doing here within our main concepts of what a web service interaction is like, what it is that we're doing. And web services are where we are working with a remote application that has an understanding of how to call methods and objects within Sage CRM that represent data and data actions. So it knows how to understand the idea of a company and how to understand the idea of an update or an insert into a company. Now that description is provided by something called the Web Services description layer within SoAP, and the application must have knowledge of it. If I switch over into a little bit of code here, in a moment, if I just stop the running of my code I had out here, and you can see over on the right hand side where I've got my solution explorer within the code, I've got something called a web reference, and we can look down to the web reference URL, and we might see here that the web reference URL, as we've got, is referring to a particular endpoint within inside the system. Now that endpoint is the web description layer, and if I actually browse to it myself, if I type in here eware DLL web services web service.wsdl, if I type that in, what we'll get back is an XML document that is describing the structures within inside the system. So there, if you like, there's a remote catalog or dictionary that explains the structures within inside CRM. So having said that, my program knows about it, and so if I run my program here, you can see that what I've got is a Windows program that knows how to connect through to CRM. And we'll see that if I type in a username and log on, it comes back, and you can see here that, that a session ID has been created, and it's confirmed that I've logged on actually as the system administrator. What I'm looking at here is this idea of an other application communicating in a way that we haven't seen yet, but is actually passing XML through to an endpoint within inside the system. Now, that endpoint is the endpoint for Sage CRM, and we pass a request in the form of a posted XML document. I say posted because you know that HTTP has a number of different methods. We can idea of getting and posting are probably the two most basic mechanisms that we know about. If we enter in something into the URL of our browser, just like here, we're getting it, and if we think about a form within inside the Sage CRM environment where we might want to click change and make a change and hit save, that's posted. Now within web services we're posting everything, and the post that we can see here has allowed us to log on and return back information from the system. But it's remote, and that posted information is in the form of an XML message. In a moment we'll look at the logs to start to understand what those XML structures look like. But it's in the form basically of an envelope, where you have an envelope with a header and then a body, and the body contains the reference to the function and the or the method and the parameters that are being passed to that. Now that's the inbound request, and everything within Sage CRM has to have, just like any other web transaction, the idea of a request response cycle. Our request goes in, it's interpreted by the web services description layer, so we make sure that our web service request refers to correct structures, adheres to the syntax that we're expecting. It then then it then goes and parses those and converts those into a series of SQL interactions with the database, working with the objects that we actually think about on a day-to-day basis, like object, person, etc. Now, if it interacts with the database, everything that we do within the database would be trackable and within the log. So we'd see all of the different actions within the database, allowing us to get the results, to turn that back into a set of XML, which is then passed back through the web services description layer back to the external application making the initial request. So it's a web request, but in the form of a posted message, which results in remote action generating an XML as the response, which is passed back into our application. So just about anything that we do, if I enter in 28 here as the unique identifier and find the company, you can see that it makes the remote request to go and fetch the company information. And then you can see it also has included the person information and the address information. So this is telling us that web services themselves aren't necessarily any slower than the main interface. But as you can see, I was using there a interface provided by Windows. So I was using a Windows form, and one of the things about using the web services is that the web services are not responsible for generating the interface. So it's not like ASP pages, it's not like Runblock, which would generate the screens that we would use. Web services here are only interested really in the create, read, update and delete of data. So it's entirely down to the idea of the data interactions. So anything beyond that has to be controlled by the programmer. So you would have to design the interface, plus if there are any errors and you want to do, you'd actually have to handle that as well. And one of the things that we'll also notice is that if we want to perform further work on this entity, then the idea of session management also has to be controlled. The idea of where we are within the conversation, which is state, and who we are within the conversation is the idea of the session. Now, SOAP is only one of the two web services that we have within Sage CRM. We have not just SOAP, but we have REST as well, and there are some considerations around performance. After all, why would you want to necessarily design an extension to Sage CRM using SOAP when you could use the ASP pages or even the .NET API? There you're using a binary interaction, and that's always faster than a remote connection using HTTP as the protocol. Well, of course, the thing about a web service interaction is that it can be remote. It can be on a completely different machine elsewhere within the network, or in fact elsewhere within the internet. Now, when we are using this, there are some realities in the sense that it's text, it's plain text that is being passed. We're not passing here a binary message, and so there is a further weight than dealing with a simple COM or an ActiveX call, and there also is further work in taking the XML that is passed and parsing it to make sure that the structure of the XML is correct and it is understood. After all, how do we know that it's a properly formatted message? Now, we are passing quite a lot of information. What we'll start to see as well is the passage of information over the web needs us to create some idea of a throttle to limit the number of characters that are passed, or in fact the number of rows which are returned. So there's a good up amount of what we want to maybe do, and we'll see where that's set in a moment. But one of the things that I would comment on is all of this behavior where I'm entering in information and where I had to, if I return back to the summary screen, enter in a password. That would all be passed through in plain text. So really we would expect this to be implemented within the context of an HTTPS or secure sockets implementation. But have a look at this example. If I put 28 in here and retrieve an individual company, we can see that this is very fast. If I change this to be the letter A and now use the idea of a search looking for companies of type customer but with that name, so companies which begin with A, what we'll find is that it'll take me a little while before the data is returned. Now all I'm doing here is retrieving back all the customers within the system whose names begin with A. There's probably a few hundred of these, but we'll find that it's taken quite a considerable amount of time in order to get the result back. Now this might seem to you a bit of an error, but actually it isn't an error, nor is it really a problem with the method that I used in the code. What it represents is an inappropriate use of this particular mechanism within inside the SOAP web services. Compare this with another mechanism that I used here, which is simply to find companies that are of type customer, and instead of using one method, which was query, I'm now using query record, and you'll find that the results come back almost immediately. This fast return of the information, equivalent amount of information being returned up onto the screen, is down to the fact that we have different methods which retrieve different amounts of data and, of course, query the database in a different way. And Sage CRM is very much a data-bound application. We're very sensitive to the performance of the database and the way in which indexing of the database tables has been carried out. And so, since we're ultimately going against the database, we have to give thought within our implementations of a SOAP-based system. Have we made sure that the necessary database tuning has been carried out? Okay, now I'm going to go on into looking at the configuration and setup of web services and the preparation for use. But I wonder, do you have any questions at this stage? Let's do a little bit of a check to see if anyone has got questions. Looks like no one is rushing in to ask any questions, which is great. So I will carry on with what I've got. So let's have a look at the configuration and setup of the web services. Now we saw that we've got a WSDL file. Now that WSDL file is present and able to be retrieved, as we can see here, because within Sage CRM I've actually already made the WSDL available for everyone. I've also made some other little changes as well to make my life a little bit easier, such as drop-down fields are described as strings in the WSDL file, and I've also chosen to force the web service logon. Well, I wonder what I mean by that. Well, if I look to where I've logged on here, and we can see that I logged on as the administrator, if I change my display away from looking at the web services description layer to instead looking at sysadmin, we can see that my system administrator logon is being used twice within the system. This indicates that I've logged on both through the main interface, as we can see here, plus I've also logged on through the web services. Within Sage CRM or within my system, if I go to where I've got users and look at the user Susan May, we'll find that we can make sure that individual users are enabled for the web services. So if I look down here, we'll see a field that indicates allow web service access is set to be true. We have to do this for individual users. This, by the way, is different from when we're dealing with the SData based API, because all users can use the SData based or RESTful API whether or not the user is enabled. There's no enabling as such. Everyone by default can use it. Excuse me just for a moment. Now, that's the setup for the screen. I had to take a sip of water there. So there's the setup of our interface. What I'm going to do, you can see that my user is able to use it. I'll save that. And so over here, what I'm going to do is log on again. But rather than just simply logging on again, I'm going to close this down and rerun that program. So I haven't exited my program gracefully. I've just crashed out. Now there's a setting inside the system which we'll see in a moment, but you can see here I've entered Maze and I log on and I'm able to access the system. And if I look for information, we'd find that in pulling back data, if I list the companies of type customer, we'll see all the different companies, but they're not the full range of companies. They are only those companies that this particular user is entitled to see. And so it's governed by security. Now I've just shut down the browser again. So at the moment, if I look at the eWare DLL sysadmin, we'll see that there are in fact 3 logons into the system, 2 with web services. Now do you notice how we've got our session ID and database alias in this column? There's the session ID that's telling us that Susan May has logged on here. Inside my screens, if I go to where within the it's the wrong button I press there. I'm inside the administration screen and down into system and down into self-service. Not self-service, I didn't mean self-service, in web services. We can see that we've got the idea of force web service logon. This has the very useful effect that if you have come out of a web service application, crashed out and not actually deleted the session, subsequent sessions can come on and remove that session for us. So in my case, I can run this. I'm going to take a note that as I look at Susan May, it ends with 747, the session ID, but if I now log on, again as Susan May, I will destroy the previous session, and if I refresh this, remember Susan May here was 747, we look at this and it's become 748. So we've got our understanding here that in logging on, I've automatically logged off the existing user's session. And that's just becomes a very useful mechanism by way in which we can ensure we don't get lost in a way, and it provides with a relatively consistent appearance from the main interface. Now you might have seen and realized that a user can log on both as the system administrator once through the main interface and again as the system administrator through web services. But let's have a look at some of the other options that are available here. We've got the control and configuration of web services. So first of all, let's understand the sizing requests. These are to do with the way in which we can limit the transaction that we're working on. First of all, we have the idea of the maximum number of records to return and the maximum size of request. The maximum number of records to return is a way of throttling the amount of data that is returned as a result of any one query. Now, you saw the way in which I requested the information from the web service application. We can see that here. If I go and say I want to use the concept of find companies using query, and I just look for companies beginning with A, we'll see that once we've passed through that message and it's running proper, it takes a little while in order to return the data. This type of return is returning more than 100 records of information, but in my particular case it only returned the first and displayed the first 100. But if there were further, you could actually take slices of the data from within the database, serving and delivering them up. And the maximum size of request makes sure that the fastest web interaction is available to us. Now, make WSDL available to all is obviously about making the document that describes the objects and methods available to a prospective development environment. If you're going to customize or provide customizations around the use of web services, then you need to make sure that the WSDL is available to everyone. And obviously enabling the web service as well is a big help. Now, with other settings, like we've got the drop-down fields of strings and send and return all dates and times in universal times, these are relatively simple in terms of wanting to make sure that we understand how the data is held between the remote application and the system application here. So it expresses a convention rather than having to work it out from the context of the data that has been returned. But we can see that we can limit the web requests from individual IP addresses as well, if so desired. And I believe that there's a few articles that describes this phenomenon within inside the community. But we've just used a false web service logon, which is using the idea that if you log on again, that existing session is destroyed during the logon of the new instance of it. So that's the idea of the configuration of the web services. And we've seen the enabling of a web service user. Now, one of the things that we can find as we are working is to look and access information about the system. Now, I talked about an environment within SOAP which is not responsible for generating the interface. But that doesn't mean that there are not methods available to us which tell us about the interface. One of the important things to realize is that, as you can see up here, we have this concept of where the target endpoint is. Now, the WSDL is all fine and dandy. So if I look at the idea of the WSDL, as you can see here, this web service description layer is providing an XML document on how we should understand the system. It's not, though, the only point, if you like, that we're going to contact. If I have this, though, my third-party system, and here if I look at the code, this idea of the properties means that I can start to reference those objects defined within inside that are defined inside the web reference and within the web service. So you can see here, I'll be actually doing this in a moment myself and creating a namespace with referencing, which references the included web reference. Within my code, as I've written in here, I might be working with fields and columns which are changing. I created this program yesterday. I did some editing and I saved this yesterday. Now, since that time, I've made a few changes to CRM. One of the changes that I made, if I go to customization and look at a secondary entity, notes, is that I removed from automatic inclusion of information the note fields. So if we look at the external access, we can see that I've turned off the display of web service information. If I look to where I've got my application running, which is over here, and look at metadata, and I now say list tables exposed to web services, we can see that 23 tables are exposed. So we look down here. But if I look elsewhere, for example, if I change this and change web service access to yes and choose save, now when I return back to my application and I run that again with saying get list tables exposed to web services using get metadata, and you'll see that there are 24 records which are returned, and that includes the notes table that we see here. Now this notes table has, and has always had, a certain number of columns available to it. Now these represent the columns which, if you like, come from the vanilla system, the default system. But I went into CRM after I had generated my WSDL, what's called my WSDL. If I go into customization for the company, we can see that we've added in a new field. If I look down here, you can see I've added a test field. Now this test field was added after I grabbed and created the WSDL within inside my application. So my WSDL doesn't actually know about the test field, not the one anyway inside here. Because when you create a WSDL connection, you are actually taking the copy and working from the copy in all of your interactions. In my case now, if I go to my WSDL and refresh this, we would find that that test field, because I've requested the test field live inside here, we can see that the test field exists inside the database. If I go back to the listing of the tables, and I then go to the notes table and click on notes, we can see that there are 10 fields exposed, including one of them, very importantly, the idea of the wrong table. I needed to go not to the notes field, I needed to go to the company table. So let's go back into where I had the metadata definition. I get hold of the user table using get data, get hold of the all tables, so 24 tables, and I look down here at the company table, click on the company table, 33 records, and what we can find is that test field has been included. So there's the test field, and it can say that it's a string. Okay, well, let's now take that a little bit further. So you'll know that there are mechanisms for allowing us to understand and access information about the underlying metadata that is interacted with within I suppose, the everyday processing that you might make with a web service application. But ultimately what we're going to do is to create a very simple application to show you the basic design and to get you going, to give you enough information to allow you to do the tasks that you want. We're going to create a simple web service that logs on, carries out an item of work, and then logs off. But before we do that, let's actually see if anyone's got any questions. There are nobody's passing up any questions into the interface, so hopefully this is all making sense. Well, no one is throwing out any questions here, so hopefully that is the case. Now we've got our web service. We are going to create a new project, and if I go into where I've got my visual development environment, I can go ahead and come to create a new project. So let's go to File, New Project. I'm going to create this as a Windows Form application, and I think I'm going to call this WS Training PM, and I'll choose OK. Now there's our form. The first things first though, when you're working with a project, we need to now go ahead and create a web reference so that we can reference the objects of the web services. To do that, we have to go into Project, and we have to choose Add Service Reference. And we can here either start to choose to browse off to where we want to go and create a service reference, or what is the preferred mechanism is if we go into the advanced references, add web reference, and then go and reference here the web services that we're connecting to. Now you'll see that this document returns back the methods as well as many. If we were to unprise this and look again, it would actually define not just the methods but also the structures like company, etc. So everything within inside CRM can be modeled within the web services. Now I'm going to call mine let's call my web service training, and I will add the reference. That has now taken from me a snippet of this time from the from our self-service, from our web service for the CRM instance that we're using. And I can go ahead and start to create the 3-button application that will do the work for me that I want it to. So here's my first item. I'm going to call this, look at the text, I'm going to call it log on. And I'll put the text in there, not the name. That's the text there. The name needs to be button log on. And once we've done that, I can actually think about creating now some other buttons. I'm going to just quickly clone those buttons. These obviously need to be changed as well, so I'll call this get version. Get version is a very easy little method. It results in a web request that pulls back from the eWare DLL, from that endpoint, the stuff that we want. So it pulls back the version as it says. So here I got the next item. Let's have a look at get version. That's the text that I want. I'm going to be calling this button get version, and in the log off I'm going to say button log off, and the text is log off. So we have these three buttons. We're still a little way away from writing any code. Let's see what we have to do. We're going to have to know how to instantiate a new session, how to be able to maintain that session, and to then be able to destroy the session when we need to. Now these are all going to reflect the ideas of security, etc. So anything that we do follows the rules for Sage CRM. My form is here, and I now need to save this, and I need to double click to start the process of creating my 3-button form. So as I go down and I think about my 3-button form, we've got our web reference. I need to use this within my code, and so I'm going to make a namespace reference, and my application is called WS Training, and I'm looking at the Solution Explorer where I had a WS Training as well, and that represents my reference to the objects. What it does mean, because I've now got a web reference or within the within the code and name reference, using that I can go ahead and carry out the actions that I want. So the log on click, I can cheat and use a little bit of snippets here, so my code snippets within the web services, and I look down and I should be able to see that I've got my log on. A couple of methods on there, whether you're using the web service logon or the web script SOAP port logon, but here is the basic idea of how to log on. There are two parts to this to be aware of. The first part is the actual practical practice of logging on, passing in the username and password for the new user, and then a second part which is assigning the returned query string into a header, so subsequent screens other than the logon need to be identified as belonging. So you need to have the idea of passing in the credentials inside the header of the web service. I mentioned earlier on that web service transactions are in the form of an envelope passed as an XML message. So it has an envelope tag, a header tag, and a body tag, and this session information will go and be added as part of the header of the message. But anyway, here's what I've got. I'm happy with my web service being called CRM service. We can see that there's other information here, like am I directing it to another account? Well, possibly, because if you think back to when I was working in here, you can see that I have got the details of another instance of CRM. If I log off, I can type in my instance name that I want, type in the username, and if there's a password, and then log on, and that would have directed me to pull my information out of this particular instance, which is 7.3. Now, in terms of the call that we've made there, if I go back into the development environment and go up to project and down to the properties of the project and look at the resources, oh sorry, not resources but settings, what we can find is that that call to the endpoint is stored here within inside of the system. So we can manually change that, or in fact what we can do is, if we don't want to manually change it, we can instead programmatically change it, and this is what we see within the code back here. So we've got the idea of programmatically changing the information within the install. This is not changing, well, sorry, within the remote program. So redirecting the remote program where it places its requests, passing in the special post envelopes. So you can notice again the fact that I'm using plain text passing in the username and password. There is no password here. That is a salutary reminder that what we need to make sure is that any of our live implementations of web services are going across secure sockets layers. Now, once I've done that, I'm left with the second part, which is making sure that the header information is displayed, and the ID is added into the header. So you won't see it echoed out. It's not a visual display, but rather I mean the display and adding into the header, so subsequent requests can get this information. Now at the moment I've only implemented the logon button, and if I look to the sysadmin page, what we can see is that we've got one web service. If I log myself out, I can do that by clicking on here, going back and refreshing, and you can see that it's pulled out, and I'm managing that log off process. The logons, by the way, and log offs, they are very simple. They're just part of a URL to allow you to, I suppose, slide the bolts to lock things on. Or I'm sorry, a log off people. There, bang, that person is now logged off, as we have nobody currently logged on. So if I log on here with my little bit of code, looks like nothing has happened, but if I go and refresh my sysadmin, we can see I've logged back on again. We need to change this. We need to get to the point where we've got our username and password being used. So if I switch over into my code once more, I can start to think about the remaining buttons. Excuse me. If I look at my design and have a look at the get version, this is where we're going to meet the idea of getting hold of a version, getting hold of a result, and then processing the result. Inside here, the snippet is very simple. And what I want to do is to choose to use this is .NET, sorry, wrong, web service snippets. I need to get hold of get all metadata, or get version I'm wanting to do. So there's my get version. And what we'll see is that our web request results in a response or a result. So a request results in a response, and it's of a particular type. This is because all results essentially are sophisticated types of buckets in which data has to be passed. We know it's in order, but we don't necessarily know which order in which it is placed or which structure it's placed. Well, our web service result here is fine, and we can see its example usage is to allow us to say, well, our CRM, actually before I do that button, get version dot text is equal to CRM version result, version string. And now if I save that, return back to the program, look at actually the design. I'm just going to change get version so it's a little bit longer. And if I run this, oh, there you go. This is very useful. We've hit a build error. So if we look at this, CRM service does not exist in the current content. This is a fairly simple thing to resolve. As I look at my form, one of the things that we can see is that I'm creating the web service reference, which I use down here, but it can't access it because this is what's called a private function or private method. So if I add it into this state, which is in the partial state for the form, now save this and run it, this should work happily. So if I log on, if I look at my screen here, we can see that it's changed over to 751 rather than 7500, and what's more, if I get the version, we can see it returns back with the version that I'm using. Let's see if anyone has got any questions. I'm just seeing if anyone's got any questions before we look at the idea of the destruction of the session. All this is all about passing and managing the session, and as we'll see in a moment within the logs, we'll see how that's actually done. And I think actually we'll go into the logs to start to explore this. Now, I've been using sysadmin to help me keep track of sessions, to be able to understand what we're doing, and this is again something that you can do as well. Very easy to be able to see and then control the log-offs and see which ones belong to web services. Any of the logons that we create shows up actually within the activity table. So it's logging in and creates the same type of session as the main interface as well. And that means, of course, that we also, because it's coming in as a post, like a form is a post, it means it's passing the values collection, and the where clause would be available as well within table level scripts, which are triggered by it as well. The logs, though, are the key things. If I jump into the logs, we'll start to see how this is working. You can see here that I need to clear down a log. This is the existing log. I'll clear down, and I'm going to repeat what we've got here. Shutting that down. We run this, we have our log on. And so if I look at web service, we can see the log on. This is all about the idea of the, as I was talking about, the concept of the header and the envelope, the header and the body. As we look at the information in here, we can see our first request. The first request includes the call with our logon method to the username and password. That creates basically the result for the logon, but you'll notice that it passes back the session ID, meaning that it becomes available then for all subsequent requests. I can do that then if I just close this down, save it, and leave that, and now hit the get version. That will have updated our log, and what we see in our log is how this time the session ID from the previous method has actually been added in to the header. So it's within the header. That is the credential that is passed, and so that would work, and what the body contains is the reference to the get version string, and that's obviously put within the main body of what we're doing. Okay, now how do we log off? We need to have that session ID in order to destroy our session. And if I go into my code and go into the form designer and click on the log off, this this button is where we're going to put in our little bit of code to carry out the destruction of the session. So my code snippets for web services, I can now log off, and you can see that this is very simple, because what it does is it takes the session value, passes it into the log off method, and this now will have built for me if I run this. I can log on, get version, and if we confirm this, you can see there are log on through the use of the web services, and if I now log off, if I choose to log off, it doesn't change any of the other buttons, but it is logged out of the system, and if I go to refresh, we can see that even that user has disappeared. Okay, now we need to get help if we are going to work with our web services, and we can't hope to really cover everything within a online environment like this. So this is why it's essential that you get familiar with where you can find help. So for example, if you're working with the web services and you're working with the cloud, then you need to come into the resources made available in here, and they include within the system administrator guide some of the control of the setup. But if you also go into the community and you have a look at web services, there's our web service, and I have a look at here documentation, what we'll find is that there is a very useful, if you look at documents, you'll see that there is the snippets which I've been using, but more importantly you'll see that there are a whole series of web service guides for web services related to the cloud. Now please note, if you are using web services within inside the main interface, then actually by my main interface I mean 7.3, then you need to make sure that you've downloaded the full developer guide, because the full developer guide includes and discusses web services. It's only if you are looking at the variant of that within the cloud that you need to make sure you've got the cloud web services guide. But having talked about the community, if you go to Roundup Web Services, you'll find that there's a lot of documentation, and you'll see that there is I'll start off with a roundup of roundups. If we look down here, we'll see that there is a roundup of SOAP-based web services. So an awful lot of documents have been written about these. It's probably one of the best documented and discussed areas of the APIs. Lots of design tips, etc. Okay. Now, having put that background information there, you also need to think about the data objects and the other objects of using CRM for more complex tasks, just exactly like this little application does here. Well, if you're doing this, then you'll need to use, if you're wanting to know about that, you should also have a look at getting hold of the web service test harness. And you can see that there's a web service training head test harness, which is the one that I'm using here. So all this is available to you and very useful. Okay, now I started to use the idea of retrieving information. I mentioned that the query was a very slow way of pulling back data. We can start to get a sense of why that is just by pulling back a couple of bits of information from within the interface. So if I switch over into where my development environment is, and what I'm going to do is stop debugging, start again. I'm going to change to make sure that I'm using 7.3, update that, and now I'm going to now I want to log on as a system administrator, and we can see that this is the idea of finding companies using query. So if I type in gate, and before I do this I should come into the logs to clear down the log. So if I pull back up and look at my web service log, I'm going to clear everything out. So now I go and do that. So what do I want to do? I want to go find, using query, part of company name. So it's looking for companies beginning with GAT, and what we'll find that it found 2 companies. That was very quick, but if you didn't have those requirements, then it might well have been much slower. And if we look at this, you can start to realize why there might be a certain amount of slowness with this particular method. Now this is calling in our code the query method and passing in the where clause through the idea of how you retrieve the data. Now this is defined inside the code of Sage CRM. If I look at my form and I need to maximize the workspace, where I'm pulling back the information from the query, you can see the way in which the SQL is constructed, so company name like, and then we're passing in that where clause into the company entity. Query is very simple in its structure. What it results in doing, and this is similar to query entity, which is only retrieving one, but query returns many. As we look at this, we've got our 2 records in here, but chiefly we'll find that in the log it's generated a massive amount of SQL. So you can see all these SQL statements. We can also see that the result set is very large, which brings us back into thinking about how large is large. Is there a limit to this? What are the concerns? And so if I go into administration, oh, I'm not logged on here, if I go into the administration, go in just thinking about what it is that I really want to show you. So I think I'll come back to that in a moment. So I won't do that. But we've got these different methods of query entity, query record. These are probably represent the hardest topics with us. Query, yes, this is what I wanted to tie it into, is in here where we have our administration screens. As we've got our discussion of within system and our web services, and we know that the amount of information, we saw that this log file containing this large amount of information, we know that there's limits placed on that within inside this screen. Okay, we will see that if there is more information to return as well, or as this works, is that we're starting to meet the concept of an abstract type. We've got to understand really how this works. So if I look at this code, we can start to see how the query works. Notice how we've got in here the idea of a query result and then something called eWare base. Well, the query result is going to be a generalized bucket that handles anything that comes back. Imagine the XML document coming back. We have to have a way of catching that, and that's what the query result is. So if we make a query, there'll be a query result. If we have a query record, there'll be a query record result. If we have any of these things like a get version, there'll be a get version result. Always a result as a result of a method that makes a request. And we've got another object which seems to be a type of an array, and this array is an abstract class, not going to be used directly with any interface element or handling for real data, but rather an abstract class which contains the concept of a result set. And as we look down here, we can see that after we've returned our or got the query and got the result, we can then start to see the results, those records within the result set. Now it's a result set, so the records represent groups of repeating tags within inside our HTML, and this is where we would basically have all of the company information laid out. So this is the type of information. It's breaking this down when we have our example of the query result into records to produce into the CRM basic. This is the abstract idea of the company. Now, as I look down through here, we can see that we're able to double check to see whether or not we're working with the company with inside the return information. Now, that array, which contains the generalized form, we need to cast into a definite object so we can reference its properties correctly, and so that's the job of the company. It's basically mapping the contents of the CRM abstract class into the concrete class of our company, and then of course we can start to reference the properties of those. That's that's that aspect of the idea of the query function. And one of the additions to this is that, of course, if you want to make a request, we saw that we're throttled on the number of rows that are returned. So inside my application, where I've got currently 2 records, if I remove the search and just go ahead and query those, this is returning all of the customers. That was pretty quick. That actually used the wrong method there. That used query record. I wanted to use query. So this is the one that I should have been using. This is very verbose because it's returning back so much information because of the very large sets of data that underneath each company record. In the WSDL, within our WSDL definition of the company, as I go back to my WSDL, and we look at company, we'll see that within the company definition, you'll see that the first 4 records or first 4 items within the definition are actually further abstract class called an eWare base, which contains the list of people, list of address, list of email and phone. Okay, now this came back, this results, and it was capped at no more than 100, so it returns only 100 at a time. But if I wanted to write out not just the first 100 records, but all of the records, then I would need to be able to stagger the results by using the concept of the more flag. So the more flag is intelligent in the sense that it looks and understands that there are more, that there's another, could be 1 record beyond the maximum that was set up here within inside the CRM screens. Okay. Now, I use their query, which was returning multiple items. Query entity is simpler, and it's the other main mechanism. All of these have examples of usage through the harness, so I'm not going to labor this. We're just discussing the fact that you've got these mechanisms, and that returns the idea of 1 entity on its own, but it's still quite verbose because it's returning not just the company information, but the person information, the address information as well. If you use query record, on the other hand, this is the most efficient way, or most speed effective way, that's probably a better way of saying it, of retrieving data from the system. So it retrieves data and it does it very, very quickly because you're only retrieving exactly what you've specified. So you actually end up specifying exactly what it is that you want to send in order to get the result back. Okay, and likewise with the query, because you're dealing with multiple rows, you have this concept of the next query record as well, and you can handle that to loop through and to be able to process everything. Beyond this, we have got other objects and functions that we can use. We have mechanisms to allow us to work with selection lists. It is important to realize that if you are working with a selection list, so if I put in 28 here and say find query entity, this selection list that we're looking at, the data for that list actually comes not from the source underlying caption, but rather the translation of that caption. And so what I'm using there and what is displayed are the UK English versions, because my system administrator on this installed machine was had English, UK English rather than US English, and the default language for the system is UK English rather than US English or any other. And so that choice of what the default language for the system is will affect what you see within the web services when selection lists are on. We've got a number of different mechanisms to allow us to handle and process data within inside the system. So we can update, we can insert, and so on, but we can also update with a more complex structure, or we can also use update record. And update is one particular mechanism, and also so we have with insertion. Now, all of these examples of how do I do this and the usage of the abstract class all contained within this little test harness. So that's one of your requirements that you have to do for really consolidating your learning here. There are different types of insertion that you can carry out because, of course, you insert a single record or a set of entities, single row, multiple set. Now, there are some things that we need to think about. There are some articles and discussions, and here this is where the whole community becomes very useful in allowing you to discuss. Oops, I'm typing into the wrong area. To discuss the topics that you most want. So here's the idea of typing in, looking for SOAP-based web services and looking for the blogs. If I look for this roundup article, we can see that there's a roundup article about using the SOAP-based web services. This is an extremely important place to go. Okay, I'm very close to the end. Let's see if we have got any questions in a moment, but before we do that, just some last minute considerations. Make sure you reference all the documentation. Make sure that you're particularly aware of the documentation for the Cloud Edition. Make sure that you've got hold of the example application that's on the community to do this. Make sure you've got the SDK to have all the snippets to help you with particular tasks. Make sure that you know how to change from dealing with your local instance of Sage CRM to the actual production instance of Sage CRM, and make sure that you're designing your application to test the basis of the system so that you're not lost on the metadata that you might be using. Okay, that's where we are within the cycle. We've got another lesson about this length in tomorrow, in which we're going to be discussing the web services. In that case, the web services are going to be largely the RESTful API, and again, it's got a lot of ground that we have to cover in this, and so this is your chance to ask any questions if you want.